Record. Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to our second Mentors Only office hours. Thanks a bunch for tuning in. This is only the second time we've done it, and the last time we did it was back in August, and we had two featured mentors talking about their own backgrounds and talking about their own experiences with mentorship here at Springboard. Today, we're having a bit more of a free-form discussion. So what I've got in mind is I've got two cases that I'd love to discuss with you all. So it's two cases specifically coming from our mentors that are working with some challenging students. And I would love to get your feedback on maybe your advice or maybe your own approaches to how you might work with a particular student or how you might overcome a particular obstacle. And it's really meant for everybody here to kind of share best practices, share tips and tricks. In our last session in August, we found that a lot of mentors were utilizing different ways to get to mentors, communicate with mentors, and there was a lot of sharing and back and forth, which was phenomenal. And so we'll start with the two cases. Afterwards, we'll have an open Q&A session. I have some questions that we didn't get to tackle in the last session, and so we'll try to tackle that today. And then if you have ongoing questions, feel free to keep it in your mind. Feel free to add it to the chat box. There's a chat function here, and so you can add your questions in the chat function, and then we can tackle that. And then at the very end of the session, I'll make sure to update everybody on any major news or things that you can look out for coming from Springboard. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
All right.
Sounds good.
Perfect. So doing a quick roll call, actually, which mentors here, you can either raise your hand or you can type in the chat box, represents the UX design course. I know we've got James, and I think he might be the only one. Awesome.
Me, no? UX design, you say?
Yes,
Yeah.
we've got two. What about data analytics for business?
That's me. I'm
Awesome.
here.
We got Nalini and Chris.
Present.
What about the foundations of data science course?
Here I am, Goran.
Awesome. Data science intensive.
Is that the career track?
Career track is going to be the last one.
Okay.
And last one, data science career track. Who's mentoring for that?
Yep, that's me.
Cool. And doing a quick roll call, I know, so we did this earlier. So we've got East Coast represented. We've got the Bay Area represented. We've got India here. And what other regions do we have represented?
Italy and Spain from my side.
Italy and Spain for Luca.
Southeast Europe.
Southern California.
Awesome. So literally all over the world. Thanks a bunch for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Okay, so then why don't we dive right into the cases that we've got on deck. So the first one, we've got one of our mentors. Oh, sorry, what was that? All good? Okay, we'll just dive right in. So we've got the first case. We've got a mentor in the UX design course who emailed in actually just this morning asking me about how to work with a particular student. And she found that her student, it felt like, was not necessarily very interested in UX or just the topic at hand. It's kind of brute force approaching the curriculum. They are reading the material, they're going through the videos, but it's not necessarily sticking. And the mentor isn't quite sure if this is actually the right path forward for the student to take UX as a career. Open question for you all. How might you essentially encourage the student to get more engaged with the material, or how might you approach the student who is going through the motions of going through the curriculum but isn't necessarily really comprehending everything? And this is particular to UX, but I'm sure that all the mentors from other courses have encountered some form of this type of student too. So I'd love to get your take on how you might approach this particular challenge.
So I can jump on this one, Paulo, if you like. So usually, I think there's like a very simple 3-step process to solving this issue, and it comes up pretty often. Pretty much every UX design student I've had comes to this realization of, do I really want to do this or not? And so the process that I've kind of built for myself over the last couple of years of teaching is, number one, in that intro call, ask very clearly, is this the sort of thing you want to do, with the explanation of what UX really is and how deep it goes, et cetera. And of course, that follows true with really any career path. But the aspect of saying that this is a design-oriented skill set, and therefore you have to have some emotional engagement to it, matters a great deal. And if you can't connect to your work, you can succeed by following the processes, but you may not actually like what you're doing long term. That initial warning gets a lot of people who aren't sure to ask that question early on and really answer for themselves, and that solves a lot of the potential issues long term. Step 2 and 3 then is really about the engagement side of things. So if people have difficulty with specific areas or topics, the first thing I usually ask is, okay, well, can we answer this question really quickly? Is it just you're missing a connection point between 2 pieces of data? Or is it just that you don't understand this very minor piece of a larger topic? Because that's usually the case. If not, if it's something more complex or an area where it just requires either a complete overhaul in their education, that's where bringing something into some sort of exercise where they can actually go ahead and experience it firsthand tends to work out in almost every scenario. Not always. I do find that there are a lot of students on occasion that just, they suddenly realize at that point, oh, I'm in the wrong place, or I'm going in the wrong direction. And that's fine. Especially with UX, there's a lot of branching career paths, and that's not a problem at all. But being able to have that conversation early on is the thing that tends to work the best for, I don't want to say solving that problem, so much as ensuring students don't either lose their minds, like, oh no, what am I doing with my life? Or just being unsure with the course that they are taking for the educational purposes.
Other approaches from other mentors in terms of tackling a student that might be not as engaged. James had a great 3-step process to it that really kind of dove into their goals and why they were taking the course, and also kind of connecting the dots between what they're reading versus how to actually apply it. I'm curious to get other folks' takes on this.
Yeah,
I wanted to. Sorry,
Yeah.
Luca.
Go ahead.
Mi scusa. Just one clarification. So, do they have many projects in the UX design program?
They have submissions, and they do have projects that they need to submit. But the big thing that they really work on are the capstones, similar to the data science intensive and the foundations course.
Avanti, Luca.
Okay. Yeah, no. From my side, I just got this approach many times because many students come from different areas, and the way to engage them is just to try to show something about UX in general. And I mean, in the course there is a part which requires something like sketching and had some creativity stuff. So this part we try to do it soft. So the way is not in this way is not so weight for the student. And the other part, which is more about design thinking and research, is something that I always say that is useful for any kind of jobs you are going to do, because it's an approach, it's a research, it's something about thinking. So in this way, I engaged, and I didn't have a lot of problem with many students, even if they after, when they arrive to the sketching and creativity side, they just put down the activities, and they just was not so active. But it was a way to engage them at least at 60% of the course.
What about for the data analytics or any of the data science courses? I know that your mentees are also tackling some pretty hefty technical challenges similar to UX design, where they might not be familiar at all with the type of content that they're experiencing now. How have you approached engaging a student that is getting very frustrated or maybe is just not really getting it?
Well, I have to admit, sorry to interrupt you. Go on, please.
No, go ahead, Goran. Go ahead. I'll come up.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. So Paulo knows from our previous conversations that I've actually faced similar situations, and for many times I simply wanted to start with that question, to ask the student, are you absolutely sure that you are at the right place at the right time now and here on Foundations of Data Science? But I was always, I'm anxious to do it because I'm afraid that I will simply scare them out of the workshop, So I'm not sure whether that approach is, very good at the very beginning of someone's involvement. Well, maybe that's because, my basic background is psychology. My formal education is psychology. So maybe I tend to think about, working, having a process with someone, which takes at least a few sessions to see whether they can warm up, whether they can really, move into this thing. But yes, I mean, as I said, Paulo knows for too many times I wanted to ask my students in the very beginning of the workshop, are you absolutely sure that this is for you?
So I cannot relate to the not being very interested part. I think that's the toughest part. I can relate though to the fact that people can get overwhelmed with so many things that they perceive that they have to do, and they get into something that in software development we call analysis paralysis, which is that they are not moving because they're thinking too many things at the same time, and then they don't get to start. So the approach that I followed for that is to, first of all, talk about one of the important, in my opinion, characteristics of this program that no other program has, which is the ability to simulate a professional environment. So in a professional environment, you don't have the time to prepare for a project to then work on the project. You just need to jump into the project. I mean, there is no other option. And I tell them that. And so I tell them that this is a good opportunity to do these cold jumps and fail, several times, because that's going to be a preparation for the professional field. The more trials you have in a situation like this is a little bit more controlled. The more experience and self-assurance it's going to give you. So in other words, essentially what I do there is that I distract them at the edge of the pool, and then I just push them. And then we take it from there. And I have had, the difference between before and the after people actually jump into the pool, and after the initial shock, they keep trying and trying and trying, which is something that I need to reassure every time. Because everybody wants to be an expert, of course. And then I give them the pep talk about what does it mean of being an expert. And so an important part of being an expert is iterations and many failures. Obviously, some experts don't talk about those. The ones that are very honest and not too arrogant, they do talk about that. But that's kind of the approach that I've followed. At the end of the game, I've told them that there are two outcomes. Either they end up actually loving data science and their passion fuels up and they keep going after the program, or they discover that's not for them. And I think both goals are okay, because in both cases they're going to know why they actually love it or not. So that's kind of my approach.
Got it. That's phenomenal feedback.
Yeah, this sounds like a really, really good idea. I mean, I will try this on the next cohort on the student of my foundation students. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and actually just kind of reviewing, it sounds like there's one kind of like James, Luca, and Goran mentioned, kind of really approaching engagement head on asking students, why are you taking a course? And this can happen at the very first call, or it can also happen a little bit further down after you've built a relationship with your mentees, because you might not want to scare them immediately, like Goran mentioned. And then another thing too, it sounds like mentees might become disengaged with the material when they are overwhelmed by looking at the curriculum and seeing just so many things. They don't know how to approach it. They might experience analysis paralysis, like AJ mentioned. And so this is kind of when you push them to dive into the course material. And essentially, it sounds like AJ really kind of assuring them that failure is a great option, especially with Springboard, because it actually gives you the room to fail. And you should actually kind of keep iterating. That's what I'm hearing. Phenomenal. So this is some great feedback, and I think I'm already thinking about how I can deliver this back to the mentor who emailed me earlier this morning about this. I've got some great tips to send her way. Let's move along to case number 2. Case number 2 is actually, I think 3 mentors have approached me about this particular type of student, which is a student that doesn't communicate. They are a student where you have your weekly call and it either feels like a brick wall that you're talking to. There's no feedback. There's really no sense of how they're feeling about the course. There's no sense of whether they are, there's no sense of how they're being challenged, because either they're not communicating what's challenging to them, or they're not communicating what they're struggling with, or they're just not communicating by giving any sort of response to any of the mentor feedback. How have you all approached this type of student? This could be either in weekly calls, you say something, they don't have a response, or they don't know what to say, or this could be over email too, where you're trying to engage them, but no response, nothing.
I definitely have one of those right now. And I honestly, I don't know the answer is the question. And this particular student, I do ask for students to send, outlines of what they want to talk about, and he doesn't. And actually, so my follow-on question to this is that if people aren't sending agendas, do we really get after them about that? Or because I think that would really help guide our conversation, but it is definitely my continually leading the conversation.
Any mentors have approaches to students that either aren't sending agendas or kind of are just like not really communicating?
Hi, this is Travis. Yeah, I think, as a UX designer, it just goes back to kind of gentle probing, asking why, or just how things are going. So it's kind of those soft skills. I think it would be really frustrating if someone's just not responsive. But I think the best method for me is just what we call like a retro. So I always just say, what's working, what's not working, and what are your goals for the next time? And I think if a student can't answer those 3 questions, then you're like, hey, this is your time. What do you want to talk about it? And just like not put it. They gotta own it a little bit. If they're really introverted and it's a personality thing, then that's one thing, and you got to be gentle with that. But I think on some level, if you're like, what's working, what's not working, what are your goals for next week? And they're like, I don't know. Then I feel pretty comfortable being like, all right, what else do you want to talk about? Nothing? Okay, I'll, next week, hopefully it'll be a little bit better. Yeah, I think, there's some encouragement. I'm super encouraging and connected. And sometimes I'm just like, how was your week? Like, how are you doing as a person? Like, what stresses do you have outside of this work? Because I think, is to the previous question, it's not that students are motivated, at least for me, it's just they are overwhelmed. And they get stuck. And so I think that's where I just start to say, what short-term goals do you want to have for next week? Okay, what do you need to do that? Oh, you think it'll take 4 hours? Great. When do you have 4 hours between this Thursday and next Thursday? And you just break it down into bite-sized chunks and you say, okay, cool. 2 hours on Saturday, 2 hours on Monday. Great. Next week we'll discuss this goal, and you kind of do that. But on some level, you're just kind of holding it loosely, and they need to own it. It's their own education, it's their own money, it's their own time. But I really encourage them, just like, hey, this is your time. What do you want out of this? And then the retro questions of what's working, what's not, and what are your goals for next week is really helpful.
And Travis, do you typically do that with every call or particular calls with your mentees?
Yeah, it's a mix. I mean, it's just my go-to kind of like thing. And I actually don't mind it if students don't send an agenda, because we just call up and I say, what's working, what's not, what do you want to do next week? What projects do you want to get feedback on? How's your resume? How's your job search going? Because I really encourage students to be going to meetups, meeting people, doing informational interviews from the start. So they're doing the coursework, but the coursework is a goal to either change careers or get a job. So I'm like really coaching and emphasizing getting a job, making connections. So I always have that in my back pocket to kind of like bring out and say, how are you doing? What do you want to do here? But I have some students that are very great at the agenda, as boom, boom, boom. And I bring it up and we just go through it. We get through a lot. But again, that's the flip side. Those are the students who are engaged, motivated, intentional. And we're talking kind of about the opposite side of that. Yeah.
Awesome. And actually, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Paulo. I mean, I have to agree with what Travis said here totally. Like, probably the most complicated situation is when I have a student on foundation school switching jobs. And that's happened for a few times. They're looking for a new job, or they're switching job. They're somewhere in between two career paths, etc. And that is I can feel their stress through the conversation, in the discussions and everything else. And then it's probably particularly important to somehow try to link what we're doing on Springboard, between us mentors and the mentees, the process, and somehow line that with the goal that they have personally. The most important goal, they have to pay the rent from somewhere, right? So that I find really to be stressful. And also I have to report back that I would say a very high percentage of my dropouts from the foundations course were actually people who were rushing to find a new job, right? Because probably they somehow perceive that their involvement in this workshop is something that will help them make the next career step or find a job, okay? And they probably didn't realize that it will take some time, even with the foundations course, right, to learn enough R and the environment to do something like that, really, to apply it. And so that's really, that's a complicated situation I've seen for a few times. So thanks, Travis, for recognizing something like that.
Got it. So from what I'm hearing, when you do encounter a student that is not communicating, not sending an agenda, or is not providing feedback, it could be coming from potentially outside stressors, like looking for a job, or them just not being able to get the material. And it sounds like from, say, Travis's and Goran's advice, really kind of hunkering down and saying, hey, you can use this time in any way, whether it be helping you with that job search or actually going through the curriculum. I want you to be able to utilize me as a mentor. And then Goran mentioning kind of also emphasizing that the material here is going to be a long play. It's not necessarily going to get you that job immediately, but this is going to be part of your initial learning, and we are here to help you get there. It sounds like a good bit of anchoring is necessary for these students, because maybe in the stress of looking for a job, in the stress of being overwhelmed, in the stress of just balancing their schedule, maybe they get lost in terms of what their original goal is for the course. And you just kind of need to reel them back in and just say, hey, let's remember, what are you trying to get out of this course? And that could be helpful. And actually going off of Travis's feedback, something that I've been encouraging some mentors to do is actually establish a very specific checkpoint with your mentees. Say week 3 or week 4 of working with a new mentee, make that a checkpoint where you start the call with just say, hey, before we dive into the material, before we dive into your agenda, what do you think of my mentorship style? What can I do more of? What can I do less of? Is feedback preferred over email, or is it preferred in person through our weekly calls? I think just that set of prompting will help mentees kind of give you more to work off of. And I think week 3 or week 4 is a really good checkpoint because you've actually started to build a relationship and your mentees are starting to encounter tougher material across all the courses. So that's something that another mentor mentioned worked for them, and I've been trying to encourage other mentors to try that approach as well. Awesome. Well, that pretty much wrapped up the 2 cases that I had in mind. So I wanted to open it up to general Q&A. And if nobody has initial questions, I actually have questions from the last session that I can go over. I wanted to open it up first to see, what are you wondering? What would you like other mentors to kind of give you input on?
One thing that I sent you privately, Paulo, which is I'm very curious about other mentors that are here who have worked in the data science intensive program. I'd like to know how they review their mentees' projects, mini projects, that is to say. If you can share that briefly, if there is anybody here, I'm not really sure.
And actually, AJ, in terms of the question of how you review mentees' mini projects, is that a question about kind of what sort of process they have, or like what sort of feedback they try to give? What are you wondering?
Yeah, I am wondering about the level of comprehensiveness. If you were also a mentor in the data science career, obviously there are 2 levels of rigor, if you will, in both cases. So I was wondering if you could share how do you find kind of the sweet spot there?
And a similar thing with the foundations and the mini exercises there. And that always leaves me puzzled, because why? I mean, all the solutions to these mini exercises, to the mini projects, right? Well, they're all similar. You know, the R code runs, or the R code doesn't run and deliver the solution, right? And then it's a sort of a zero or none situation. I mean, either they've submitted the mini project and then I'm totally okay with it, or they didn't and I'm waiting for them to do it, right? And I have no real way of knowing what's the level of comprehension with a student. For example, they have a mini project on logistic regression, generalized models, something like that, right? But they don't use that technique that model in their capstone project. So for the capstone project, I can say with certainty, okay, you got it or you didn't, right? But as of the mini projects, I don't have a chance to provide an oral exam to them, right? And then to figure out whether they actually know what they're doing, or they did, you know, a Google search and figured out how to code. I mean, I don't say that my students or mentors do it. Actually, I think that they're really, really working on it. I can tell that from our meetings, right? Okay, but then again, I have to admit it's a good question, because evaluating mini projects is particularly difficult. Why? Well, there are several ways to solve them, but not 1,000 ways to solve them. Okay, so the code actually delivers or not. That's the problem, you know.
Yeah, I'm also foundations of data science, and I haven't been carefully checking the mini projects, but I talk to them constantly to say, look, you know, you can tell if the answer is right or wrong, but there's a lot of ways to do things, and some are easier and better than others. So please bring to me anything that you want to see if there's a better way. And a lot of times, for example, that Titanic project always comes up, and so, you know, unfortunately, it means if somebody isn't really being clear with me that they think that, you know, that they were challenged by this part or whatever, and they just move on, then they're going to get through. But what I'm always trying to tell them is bring it to me. Let's put it on your agenda. If there was a piece of this project, even though you turned it in and it's fine, and, you know, all that stuff, that you think that there might be a better way.
Makes sense.
Other mentors, I know you in UX, you also have mini projects and things you have to submit, and then in data analytics, you have cases that students are submitting. How are you typically evaluating whether a student is actually comprehending what they just submitted or what they've worked on?
I feel like you can usually tell from their code when you're looking through if they just kind of copied and pasted something. Especially a lot of the times what you'll see is if there was something from the instruction that they said, like they bring up a certain function and they say, you know, if they brought up a certain function in the instructional videos that were prior to the exercise, sometimes people feel compelled to use that, even when it's not the correct way to do it. And also just, you can kind of tell, I mean, I'm really looking more than anything to see like the flow of thought and to see if they are actually like following like a data science way of thinking about the problem, rather than just kind of taking an ad hoc solution and putting it on top. Because sometimes they will get it right, but you can tell that also they like didn't really understand what they were doing. I guess that's my contribution.
So for the data analytics course, I mean, I've had only 2 students so far, and I find that, you know, we discuss the questions in our weekly call, the questions that come up in the cases, and you know, at least with both of my students, I find that they're thinking a little bit beyond what the actual question is asking, and that gives me a good feeling that they're actually, what should I say, they're actually thinking about the case beyond what the specific question that the exact case is asking, which I thought was a good thing. And I think maybe if we encourage them to do that a little bit, it'll sort of get them to think more. So, you know, like sometimes, you know, the cases are related to specific hypotheses that they're asking questions about. And sometimes they'll say, well, one of the students will say, well, it can be because of this too. And I say, yes, but how do you think you would go about finding the answer to something like that? And we'll just chat about it in general, a little bit beyond what the exact question that the case is asking, which sort of helps me understand whether they are thinking the right thing too.
Yeah, I have a similar approach too. And I'll often do it. I often say to them, like, pretend you're an actual data scientist, right?
Yeah.
You have limited resources, you have limited time.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of ways you could solve this problem, but what's like the top 1, 2, 3 things that it could be? And then like, what would you do to go after that, right? And forcing them to like really narrow it down like that, first off, gives me an idea of like where they're at in terms of their thinking, but also I think helps them focus on like what the real problem could be. And I think that that's in some ways like more valuable than just like going through the questions, because
Right.
it allows you to start thinking like a data scientist, right? Which is the idea.
So in my case, I didn't mention how I do it, but in my case, I tell them from the first meeting that I like to review the code with them. So I've been doing software development for 20 plus years, so I'm used to read a lot of code. But usually I don't have the time to do it before the meeting. So what I do is that I ask them to walk me through their code. I tell them that we could review a mini project in about 5 minutes, so they know that they have to prepare for that. And I tell them that the additional advantage to them, besides getting their code reviewed, is that it allows them to develop the communicational aspects of interacting with other professionals. So, so in that way, that allows me to ask questions that are pertinent to whatever they're doing, and they can actually ask questions. So that's kind of the way that I've been doing it. So the difference between the data science intensive and the data science career is that in the second part, the reviews are longer. So they're usually like 15 minutes. And again, I tell them in advance that that's what I'm going to do, that I will ask them questions, that they can ask me questions. And then if I feel that there is something that is not well understood, I tell them, you know, I think that you need to give it another iteration here, and this is what I want you to concentrate on. And that's kind of the way that I do it.
Got it. So from what I'm hearing, it sounds like in terms of how you all measure your mentees' comprehension of what they just learned, part of it is having them explain what they just learned, and measuring their comprehension just purely from what they deliver, and then also measuring whether they can think beyond the scope of the problem or think beyond what they just explained. And actually, I've heard this come up a few times with other mentors, but really thinking about putting yourself in the business context is something that really helps push mentees. Thinking about, oh, as a UX designer, if you were in the business, how would you apply what you just learned? And how would you teach this, or how would you get feedback from other stakeholders? For data analytics, if you're in the business, how would you apply this technique to a business problem? Same thing for data science. If you're a data scientist in industry, what are you actually doing with what you just learned? It sounds like it really pushes students to measure their comprehension and actually kind of really reflect on what they just learned.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, we're coming up on time. It's the very last few minutes. And so if you have more questions, feel free to send it my way, either via email in Slack or even in the chat box. And what I'll try to do is I'll queue it for the next office hours. Essentially, I'm just building a whole bank of questions that we can cover. And as we wrap up, I just wanted to cover a few different things, just announcements from the Springboard side. So I think you all already saw, we have our next office hours already scheduled for November 1st. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to time every office hour session with a new cohort. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the cadence that you can look forward to. Mm-hmm. In terms of major things coming up, so we of course had the major Skype transition. Definitely let me know if you're encountering any bugs or encountering any difficulties with the new layout and with the flow. We just announced the new pause, freeze, and cancel options for mentees. So if your mentees have questions about that, send them along to their student advisor. Mm-hmm. And just to clarify with everybody, so our student advising team has grown. It's 4 people now. Mm-hmm. For the data analytics course, Katarina is a student advisor. For the UX design course, Hallie is a student advisor. For the data science career track, Kane is a student advisor. And then for the foundations and intensive data science courses, Chris is a student advisor. So essentially we have 1 student advisor roughly for each course. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Outside of that, some of you have already seen some major curriculum updates. The data science career track has had a curriculum update. The data science intensive has had an update. Next on deck is the foundations course and UX design course. So the foundations and UX design course, we have curriculum updates coming next month. And essentially, just so you all know, our typical cadence for major curriculum updates will be roughly every 6 months. And we'll definitely let you know if there are major things that we're taking away, that we're adding in, or any major changes to the curriculum. Just be on the lookout. And after that, the very last thing I have to mention is for the data science and data analytics courses, we're going to be cleaning up Slack a little bit. I know there's a lot of channels. You might not even know which channels to use. And so we're going to be consolidating those starting next week. Be on the lookout. And we're also going to be adding what's called a resource library to the student community. This is only going to be accessible by mentors. And essentially, if you have additional resources, articles outside of the curriculum that you send to mentees, add it to this library so you can share it with other mentors. UX design mentors might already think, don't we already have this? Yes, we actually piloted it with the UX design course. We consolidated the Slack channels and we created the resource library, and it's been working out really well. And so now we're going to be rolling it out to the rest of the courses. So just an FYI. All right, well, those are the major updates from me. Let me know if you have feedback. Let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, I'm gonna sign off, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.